Ireland, a peaceful, prosperous island nation that somehow all of America is descended from. Looking at you, Bridget. But in the 20th century, Ireland was a violent and chaotic place, and no event shows this more than the outbreak of violence on Easter 1916. Hello, and welcome to Basic History on the Easter Rising. The century before the Rising took place was not great in Ireland. The Act of Union was passed in 1801, formally joining Great Britain and Ireland into the United Kingdom, a move that abolished the Parliament in Dublin, and instead Ireland would elect 100 MPs straight into Westminster, where they would be dwarfed by the much larger British contingent and easily outvoted. Britain got Ireland to go along with this in part by promising Catholic emancipation, which, that didn't happen. And if you are at all surprised by the British Empire negotiating in bad faith, then you really need to read more history. I'm going to skip over most of the rest of the machinations of the 19th century to keep this video down to a manageable length. Just know these longer type videos on the subject absolutely exist here on YouTube, and I thoroughly recommend checking them out. It's actually very fascinating stuff. For us though, we're going to jump forward to 1914 and the outbreak of World War I. See, the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by John Redmond, had managed to get the current Labour government under Asquith to agree to Home Rule, a form of limited local government in Ireland, under this radical idea that the Irish should have some say in how their own country is run. Pretty crazy stuff. Anyway, Home Rule was introduced in the House of Commons in 1912, despite the fury of Unionists such as Edward Carson. Side note, Unionists being Irish people who wanted to remain in the Union with Great Britain, as opposed to Nationalists who wanted greater independence. Anywho, the Unionists would form an armed militia, the Ulster Volunteers, to support their political agenda, and the Nationalists would respond in kind, with the Irish Volunteers being the biggest, although others, such as the Irish Citizens' Army, also existed. Things were incredibly tense during this Home Rule crisis, with protests and clashes between armed groups rocking the small island. World War I ended this crisis, as implementing Home Rule would be postponed until after the war. The Ulster Volunteers rushed to join the British Army, and feeling under pressure to do the same, John Redmond announced that the Irish Volunteers should also join the British and fight in the war, to show their loyalty and earn the gratitude of Great Britain, which Redmond believed would lead to greater concessions after the war. The Irish Volunteers would split after this, with the majority supporting Redmond and the war effort. A smaller force of around 10,000 would remain in Ireland under Owen MacNeill and follow their original mandate. There was also a third option that some men took, joining the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB. A much more republican and much smaller organisation, the IRB was committed to Irish independence at any cost, and saw the calamity of World War I as an opportunity to strike a mortal blow to perfidious Albion. The IRB would begin infiltrating and influencing groups such as the Irish Volunteers to grow more radical and begin planning for a countrywide rebellion. It would be aided by Clan na Gael in the United States. Formed of Irish immigrants, it would be the source of much of the funding of the IRB. These Irish revolutionaries looked to the German Empire as its natural ally in this cause. The Germans were not interested in any plans to land troops on Irish soil, which, probably a good call, what with all that Britannia rules the waves shenanigans. They were willing to supply weapons and ammunition, however. Roger Casement was the man entrusted with this vital shipment, and he had travelled to Germany to see the deal done. He returned to Ireland in a German U-boat and landed on Bannostrand on April 21st and was almost immediately captured. The cargo ship carrying all the German material was captured the next morning, dealing a massive blow to the Rising. But not necessarily a decisive blow, as the British authorities decided not to act on this clear evidence of imminent violence for some reason. What was a decisive blow to any chance of the rising succeeding was when Owen McNeill, leader of the Irish Volunteers, discovered the plans and ordered his men not to take part. He didn't think a rising had any chance and refused to throw his men's lives away on a hopeless cause. The majority of his men would follow this order, leaving the rebellion without any foot soldiers. On April 23rd, Easter Sunday, the leaders of the rising met in Liberty Hall to discuss these blows to their plans and decided to go ahead with the rebellion anyway on the next day, Easter Monday. Padraig Pearse was elected both President and Commander-in-Chief of the Provisional Republic. They hoped that as fighting began in Dublin, the rest of the country would follow their lead. Spoiler alert, they didn't. And so, on the morning of the 24th, about 1,200 members of the Irish Volunteers and Irish Citizens' Army, backed up by the 300 women of the all-female Cumann na Ban, they occupied key locations around Dublin, such as Four Courts, Boland's Mill and St Stephen's Green, but failed to capture the docks or the railway station, a critical mistake. The leaders of the rising marched to the General Post Office, or GPO, escorted by 400 volunteers, where they raised the new flag of the Irish Republic and Padraig Pearse stood to deliver the proclamation of the Irish Republic. This proclamation had the signatures of the 7 leaders of the rising. It's a key document in Irish history, and I've included the full document in the description and recommend everyone reads it. All 15 of you. The only real fighting on the first day was around Dublin Castle, the heart of British rule in Ireland. James O'Brien, an unarmed policeman, was shot, becoming the first death in the rising. This fierce fight lasted throughout the day, but ultimately the British inside held on and reinforcements arrived to push the rebels back. There was also fighting in the South Dublin Union, where a uniformed nurse, Margaret Keogh, was shot dead by British soldiers, the first dead civilian of the rising. The British were taken completely by surprise by the uprising, somehow. This led to an uncoordinated response in the opening hours of the fighting. By Tuesday, this would change, however, as large amounts of reinforcements would arrive in the city. By the end of the week, there would be 16,000 British troops in Dublin, and they would begin systematically assaulting rebel positions with artillery and machine guns. This grinding assault would lead to massive amounts of destruction and large civilian casualties. This firepower disadvantage would grow worse as the patrol boat Helga sailed up the Liffey and began shelling rebel positions. This set up the rest of the week, as the British would isolate and assault rebel positions, mini sieges inside the larger city siege. The rebels would fight fiercely, usually causing more casualties than they suffered, before British firepower would force them to retreat or surrender. This would carry on until Saturday. The GPO would be shelled and the volunteers would be machine gunned down as they tried to flee. Padraig Pearse would admit to reality and surrender. The city centre was in ruins, infrastructure destroyed and lives disrupted. 485 people had died, over half of them civilians. The rebel leaders were taken into custody and public opinion was overwhelmingly against them. They were blamed for all the death and destruction, and the rising truly seemed to be shaping up to be a very lame duck attempt at independence. This was until the British decided to do 2 things. 1. Punish all rebels incredibly harshly, and 2. Cast a very, very wide net when identifying these rebels. Owen McNeill, the head of the Irish Volunteers, who had refused to take part in the rising, was arrested, along with over 3,500 men and women. Many of these would be held without trial in Wales and England. 90 were sentenced to death in secret trials, one of these being the woman Countess Markievicz. Look her up. Many of these would be commuted, but in the end 14 would be killed by firing squad, including all 7 signatories of the proclamation. Roger Casement would be hanged in August. This heavy-handed response to the Easter Rising changed the Irish people's attitudes. The executed rebels seen as martyrs to a noble cause, and the British seen as cruel and tyrannical overlords. The resentment would continue to grow as calls for independence would only increase.